Hello everyone, imagine this. You're adorned in layers of petticoats, corsets, and a giant hoop skirt. You're at a royal ball, sipping tea with nobles, and suddenly nature calls. Now what? How do you lift all that fabric? Where do you even go? And more importantly, how on earth did women menstruate in those dresses? Welcome to the Victorian era, an age of elegance, strict decorum, and truly baffling hygiene challenges. For decades, Victorian women were trussed up in crinolines and voluminous dresses, with Queen Victoria herself being a fashion icon of this style. These puffy garments symbolized ideals of femininity, grace, and decorum. But beneath the grandeur lay a daily struggle most history books don't mention. In the early Victorian era, flushing toilets and underground sewers were non-existent. Europeans hadn't yet adopted the concept of the toilet, and when nature called, you answered wherever you were. When you got to go was simply a fact of life. Without indoor plumbing, people relieved themselves wherever they could, behind trees, in open fields, or right inside their homes. Yes, inside. The saying, "didn't have a pot to piss in," wasn't just an insult, it was a harsh reality. The pot referred to a chamber pot, a simple bowl for collecting urine and feces. If you didn't own one, your only option was to go outside and hope for privacy. The streets were not clean. Victorians often tossed the contents of these pots straight out the window, onto the cobblestones below. High-heeled shoes and umbrellas weren't just fashion, they were survival gear in a city where waste could rain from above. The chamber pot, or jerry in British slang, was a household staple. It came with a lid, which, once used, was sealed tightly, a warning that the pot was full. In grand Victorian homes, you'd never see a chamber pot openly displayed, but they were everywhere, hidden in ornate cabinets or built into chairs. Servants constantly emptied them, as even wealth couldn't escape nature's call. If you had money, your private bathroom might be a wooden bench with a hidden chamber pot. But the question remained, where did the waste go? Enter the garderobe, a medieval-style toilet built on upper floors, often hanging precariously over streets or alleyways. When it was time to empty the pot, the answer was simple: open the window and toss. To avoid drenching passers-by, a shout would ring out, "Gardello," French for "watch out for the water," a polite warning that something very impolite was about to fall. The stench was unbearable. Homes and streets overflowed, and entire cities drowned in their own filth. Some streets even had raised stone steps, so pedestrians could leap over the running waste. Here's the real kicker. During the Napoleonic and English Civil Wars, government agents collected chamber pot contents. Why? Because urine was refined into saltpeter, a crucial ingredient for gunpowder. Your pee quite literally fueled war. And what about the women of that era, draped in layers of crinolines, petticoats, overskirts, and bodices? So many layers that undergarments like knickers weren't even necessary. With all that fabric, no one noticed what wasn't underneath. Yes, you heard that right. For much of the Victorian era, ladies walked around without knickers. It wasn't until later, when those massive bell-shaped crinolines began catching wind and flipping women over in public, that modesty demanded a new solution. Only then did society whisper, perhaps it's time for drawers. But these weren't what you're thinking. Early Victorian underwear was crotchless. Two pant legs connected only at the waist, with a split down the middle. Overlapping flaps of cotton offered just enough coverage until you squatted, and they parted like stage curtains. Why? Because ladies weren't about to lift 20 pounds of petticoats, shifts, and skirts every time nature called. These open-crotch drawers allowed a woman to simply lower herself over a chamber pot gracefully and discreetly. So, how did it work? Chamber pots for women were specially designed, not round like men's, but oval with scooped insides to fit snugly between the thighs. A lady would position the pot beneath her skirts. No squatting was necessary, just a subtle maneuver under the fabric. Done right, no one in the room would even notice. At fancy balls, entire retiring rooms were set aside for this. Inside, multiple pots were ready, and maids stood by like battlefield nurses. One would lift the lady's many gown layers, while another positioned the pot. Afterward, a quick wipe with a damp cloth, and she was back to the ballroom as if nothing had happened. Not all women had that luxury. For many, the process was simpler and rougher. It was just pot on the floor, skirts up, squat, clean up with whatever was on hand, old newspapers, leaves, corn cobs. At the very base of a woman's wardrobe was the linen shift. Soft, washable, and changed often, sometimes daily or with every new outfit. Maids and servants, though, wore fewer layers and lived without the luxury of elaborate gowns or private retiring rooms. Privacy in the Victorian world was a luxury few expected, especially for using the toilet. Modesty didn't apply when nature called. In poorer homes, entire families would relieve themselves in front of one another. There were no separate water closets, no locked doors, just the pot, the floor, or the yard. And at high society events, gentlemen would simply stroll into the garden and do their business among the roses. But let's get to the gritty part. How did Victorians wipe their bottoms? Brace yourself. One of the most popular tools of the early Victorian era was the dried corn cob. Yes, corn on the cob minus the kernels. It was rotated like a crude roller brush to clean the area. And if that sounds primitive, remember these weren't delicate instruments. They were reused, cleaned only occasionally, if at all. Another favorite was the sea sponge on a stick. After each use, it was dipped into a communal bucket filled with salt water or vinegar, then reused again and again. And it wasn't just the Victorians. Early humans wiped with rocks, dirt, and clay. Comfort wasn't the point. Cleanliness was debatable. It was about doing what had to be done. Other items used were leaves, straw, and seashells. As paper became more common and affordable, Victorians turned to printed materials, newspapers, catalogues, even magazines. If you wondered what happened to last month's issue, it might have ended up in the chamber pot. Toilet paper, as we know it, didn't begin to appear until the late 1800s with patents, and wasn't mass-produced into soft-rolled sheets until the early 1900s. Before that, a trip to the bathroom was not the refreshing experience we take for granted. So how exactly did Victorian women manage menstruation in those mountains of fabric and steel-caged crinolines? First, it's important to know that Victorian women had fewer periods than women do today. Why? 3 main reasons. Puberty started around the same time, 12 to 14, but menopause often came early, sometimes in their mid-30s. On top of that, poor nutrition and relentless physical labor meant many women had low body fat, often leading to irregular cycles. But fewer periods didn't mean no periods. When that time of the month came, Victorian women faced it without a single pad, tampon, or disposable product. They got resourceful. Women didn't wear tight-fitting underwear. Instead, their basic undergarment was a linen shift, a long washable layer that protected expensive dresses from body oils and stains. When bleeding began, they turned to something called a tea bandage. Picture a primitive bikini bottom tied at the waist and secured with a strip of cloth that ran between the legs. Inside, it was packed with absorbent rags. If a woman was too poor for cloth, she might use moss, sheep's wool, or layers of grass, whatever she could find to soak up the blood. These rags were not thrown away. They were washed, dried, and reused again and again, month after month. Women often had to change their tea bandage as many as 12 to 20 times a day, depending on their flow. It was exhausting, uncomfortable, and utterly necessary. On lighter days, some simply wore thicker petticoats, hoping the extra fabric would catch what needed catching. Later in the Victorian period, split crotch drawers became common, but they offered almost no real protection. They were designed for ease of bathroom use, not for dealing with the mess of menstruation. And through it all, women were expected to remain graceful, poised, and utterly silent about what they were enduring. Pain, blood, odor, it all had to be managed beneath layers of silk, lace, and iron discipline. No one talked about it, but every woman lived it. So how did Victorians wash those massive floor-sweeping dresses, the ones with trains, lace ruffles, and yards of velvet? They didn't, at least not like we do today. Victorian laundry was an ordeal, a physically grueling, water-hauling, soap-scrubbing, back-breaking ritual. For many households, it was done only twice a year, during what was grimly called the Great Wash. Imagine waiting 6 months to clean your clothing. That's not laziness, it's survival. Victorian dresses weren't dropped into a washing tub with detergent. Full washings were rare and risky. Water and soap could ruin fine fabrics. So instead, women cleaned their dresses by sprinkling them with talcum powder, brushing off the dust, and along with it, the odor of sweat and skin. It didn't remove the smell, it just covered it. If a dress wasn't being worn, it was carefully folded and stored in cedar-lined trunks or closets designed to keep out moths and insects. These were treasures, not just clothing, but works of craftsmanship sewn with astonishing skill, detail, and the finest materials available. And yet these garments were worn until they were threadbare, or until the stench was so overpowering it practically screamed before you even entered the room. But beneath those elaborate gowns, hidden from view, was the real shield against filth. Layers upon layers of washable undergarments, shifts, chemises, petticoats, crinolines. These absorbed sweat and protected the valuable outerwear, and those could be scrubbed by hand in boiling water with harsh soap, often by overworked maids or laundresses. Victorian beauty came at a cost, and that cost was sweat, time, and smell. So now, here's the real question. If you had the chance, would you turn back the clock and live like this, layered in silk and soot, walking through sewage, brushing powder over body odor, and managing periods with moss and rags? Let us know in the comments below.